Welcome back. We're moving on from universals to contrasting concepts, particularly in religious traditions. And this is pages 77 through 82, 81, 82. Teaching religion in world history is very important. Religious traditions are central to all kinds of political, legal, social, familial practices, and even in the modern world, in the 21st century, you can look at political debates about laws, about marriage, about abortion, about childbirth, about discipline, about education. It's so many things. Religious belief informs many social and cultural debates and historical developments. So it's very important to look at religion and the institutions, how they evolved, how they developed, how they began, and how they influenced people in their societies. But of course it's a sensitive topic. I think over the years I've had some pretty significant challenges from atheist students, from Muslim students, from Christian students, from Catholic students, from Hindu students, people who objected to an objective presentation of their religious beliefs. And in the case of the atheists who have complained, their objections were somewhat different, but they had more to do with why are we spending time on religious themes at all? These are all fantasies and so on. But it's all important. It's human culture, it's human activity, and it affects our daily lives and thinking. Students want to discuss a lot about belief. Belief is, of course, it's historical, but it's not exactly historical, but the effects of belief are historical. So if people believe that there's a prophet of God, we don't really know that, and there's no way to really verify that. But if people follow that person and feed that person and visit homes and use the roads and stop at pilgrimages, and so that's all historical. So religious practice is historical, and that I don't mean that in any way as a detractor or as an insult. It just, what's historical is what's objective and verifiable. What isn't historical is what is not objective and can't be demonstrated to somebody else using evidence. So I remember reading an essay a few years ago by a Catholic theologian who said that he believed that the most destructive concept to enter into American thinking in the 20th century was the idea of historical Jesus. This made no sense to me at all. It really didn't. Obviously it wouldn't. I'm a historian. But it didn't make any sense to me. It still doesn't. I kind of understand his objection. When I was working on this material on Islam, I also encountered that with some. I took all of this material to believers and specialists to see if there was anything that people found offensive, and one of the imams with whom I spoke about these pages on Islam had several people in his office at the time, believers and supporters, and they objected to my use of the name Muhammad without adding, a declarative afterwards about the significance of Muhammad and the importance of Muhammad and how blessed he was. But I can't really do that because that isn't what this is. It's a discussion of historical Muhammad, and it's very important, I think, for students, and it's a significant step in students' intellectual development and also development as citizens who have authority to govern themselves, to set aside their conditions of belief. I will never tell students what my personal beliefs about religion are. Sometimes I'll tell them, well, when this class is over at the end of the semester, if you want to go for coffee, you and I could talk personally. But a lot of students, I mean young students in particular, they they suppose that if I'm lecturing on something or teaching on something that I must automatically believe in that thing. But of course that's completely ridiculous and completely false. My PhD's in German history, and there's all kinds of Germans in German history of whom I don't approve, and I don't care for their ideologies and so on, and yet I think that they're still highly influential and essential to the narrative of modern Germany and so on. Well, it's the same with religion. That students need to separate themselves even from their own religious beliefs. I've had Native American students who really were not interested in discussing anything about Christians because they said they hate Christians. That Christians are responsible for so much persecution, and the only religion that they wanted to discuss would be the religion of their own grandmothers. But that's just not historical. It's not a historical method. So I think it's important to make that distinction and to insist on the separation of these two conversations right at the outset. This isn't theology. We're not discussing theology. We can discuss the impact of theology, and I suppose objectively historians could discuss sort of as intellectual history theological concepts. Certainly historians do that, but in this world history class that isn't really what we're doing. So we look at these texts just as primary sources not that are historically accurate and not that are historically true or not true, but simply that carry a truth about followers, a truth about believers, and so on. So these pages 77 through 79 look at these three related religions because they're so predominant in American society and in the 21st century. They're not the only religious practices. There's lots more, and there's lots more at my university and so on, and we sort of allude to some of that. But these 3 pages, I think it's helpful for students to hear these 3 discussed as related. It's a famous story, besides which it accounts for a large percentage of the world's population. So again, this is world history in the way that I've organized this class and this textbook. It really just touches on the tip of some major topics, like with the Mahabharata, just these 3 pages on myth, and then 1 page on the Mahabharata, and a page in the appendix from the Mahabharata, and then the student has the opportunity to delve deeper into that with some responsible beginning. Well, it's the same here with Islam and the main terms. I want students to use these terms correctly, to use verbs and the nouns correctly, and to have some appreciation of some of the very basic ideas. And with Islam, it's probably a little bit easier, more streamlined maybe than a lot of religious beliefs, because the single phrase, "There is one God and Muhammad is his messenger," I think really does apply to every Muslim practice of any type, of any century, of any family, of any mosque in the history of Islam. So it is one of the largest religious practices that has a text that is historically accessible, and that also is just, at least with that part, the precepts of the teaching are also accessible, and I find that very, very handy. So the terms are Muhammad, Qu'ran, Sunnah, and so on. There's 2 passages from the texts about the life of Muhammad that I think are helpful and instructive about Muhammad's relation to women, because women approach him and discuss. But then this passage from the Qu'ran on page 79, this is I think is one of those wonderful sacred passages that believers can use to supersede some of the harsher practices. So people ask, what do Muslims do with some of these really brutal kinds of laws and brutal kinds of statements and from God in the Quran? Can they follow all of those? It's the same as a question on these practices from the Old Testament that we looked at earlier, can practicing Jews really follow those things? Are they really stoning sons to death when the sons are unruly, or not even stoning them, taking them to the men of the town outside of the city walls and having them stone them to death? Are they really doing that? Well, they're not, and one of the ways that they address that, and the same way that Muslims address some of the really brutal and harsh kinds of laws that are laid down in their sacred text, is through passages like this. There are passages that say that one's relationship to God, an internal relationship, and a relationship based on faith or on love or on kindness and generosity and cooperation with neighbors and things like that, that boil down to something like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That those passages can be adopted, and people can follow those sort of in lieu of following stoning their sons to death and cutting off people's hands and cutting out their tongues for minor offenses. So I think it's important for a lot of students to recognize that with this passage, whether they're Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or Jew. I think it's important that they recognize that Islam has these passages, and this one in particular, but Islam, like Christianity, like Judaism, like Hinduism, like Sikhism, they have these passages to which they can appeal for a more compassionate society, for a society that's more forgiving and still is following a correct teaching. This project 15, what the Quran says about Jesus, is on page 15, or sorry, page 81, and it's just another opportunity to get the students to visit a primary source on their own, to find out how to visit the primary source, to read some passages from it, and to offer some light interpretation. I'm not asking for a theological treatise on the Quran or on Jesus in the Quran, just a passage, and what does the passage appear to mean to you? And a responsible interpretation would be all I would really want. And I get a range of answers, but generally I think the answers have been fair and have been clear. Next, we'll look at the Anglo-Saxon blessing, which is an ancient Christian practice, one of many sorts, and how to interpret a sacred text or a sacred ritual. So I hope you enjoyed that quick talk on Islam and the World History Workbook.